Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Riot Science Club. For those of you who are new here, Riot stands for Reproducible, Interpretable, Open and Transparent Science, and it's a seminar series that is entirely early career researcher led. As you can see on the schedule on the right, we have seminars pretty much every week, and we occasionally have some other events like conferences and workshops as well that you can check out on our website. This week, we have Dr. Tim Rakow. He's going to be speaking to us about adversarial collaboration, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about him in a second. But just before we do that, let's just quickly go through some housekeeping. So as you can see, the event is happening on Microsoft Teams live events. It has a Q&A option that you can find on the sort of top right-hand side. And questions will be moderated by myself and the co-producers that are here today. So please do keep your questions and comments relevant and respectful, as always. We're going to feed all of the questions to the speaker, but obviously we have to have a way to prioritize questions. So do upvote the questions that you want us to answer first, and we're going to go through them in that order. If you do join late, don't worry, you can pause, rewind, and fast forward, and you can also turn on auto subtitling so you can see captions as well. If you do like these events, please do support our work by subscribing to our YouTube channel, following us on Twitter, and subscribing to our mailing list. And please do tell your friends and colleagues about Riots and send us over any sort of suggestions for future speakers that you might have. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Tim Rakow. So Tim is a reader in psychology at King's College London. He has over 20 years of experience of supervising research and teaching research methods to psychology students. He uses a range of research strategies to examine human judgment and decision making. He's published over 50 research articles in more than 25 different academic journals, spanning the disciplines of psychology, health, medicine, decision science, and behavioral economics. Today, he's going to be speaking to us about adversarial collaboration, open science, and its best. Thank you, Tim. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to speak about what is perhaps a very little known open science innovation. So I noticed that when a recent survey came through asking about which open science innovations I was aware of, it wasn't listed in there. But I think it's a really interesting approach, and I'd like to sort of share this with you. Much of what I'm going to talk about is in a recent book chapter that I've written, and I think the book, which is coming out likely in the middle of 2022, might be of particular interest to many people in this group. So it's an edited book that's looking at open science innovation, but specifically relating it to clinical psychology. So it's a slightly curious title they've given it. I think they're not promoting questionable research practices, but telling you how to combat them. But I think nonetheless, you'll find it an interesting read. So what is adversarial collaboration? Well, I should say it goes by a couple of other names, and sometimes it exists in a paper or in a collaboration or a research project, and it isn't labelled as such. But here are three working definitions from some papers that give you a sense of what this type of collaboration is. So the key thing is, it's unusual in that people who have different views on a scientific question resolve to work together and to actually jointly design research and to often pit their alternative hypotheses against each other in a study, or more often a series of studies. These working definitions sometimes mention the presence of an arbiter or a referee, so an independent individual to oversee things. That's not a feature of all adversarial collaborations, but you'll see from the papers that I describe that that's in there in some papers. So I'd like to take you to what, as far as I'm aware, is the first published example of this. No doubt there'll be one that's older than this that people might be aware of, but this is a really nice example. 1988, well before people had probably started using the term open science, and yet I think you'll find that this embodies a lot of the principles of reproducible and transparent and open research practices. So it's a paper from organizational psychology, from the aspects of organizational psychology that are heavily influenced by social psychology and social cognition. The paper looks at goal setting and has two parties, Miriam Erez and Gary Latham, who are described as the antagonists. So they're the people with opposing views on a scientific question, and they brought in Edwin Locke, who was known to both of them, to oversee that process. I think these pictures are much more recent than when the collaboration actually took part, so they were much younger researchers at the time. So what was their issue? So they're looking at the role of active participation in goal setting. So if you're, for example, an employee and you've got a goal that you're carrying out, are you more committed to that goal and more successful in achieving that performance goal if you have some say in actually setting the goal? Now, there are various bits of theory that would suggest that that would be the case, but Latham consistently found across a series of studies and points to meta-analyses that actually involving someone in the participatively in setting the goal actually makes minimal difference. Erez has data that takes a different view. So she finds that when you have a group discussion and you involve people in setting a goal, that actually you're more likely to commit to the goal and more likely to achieve higher performance levels on the goal. Now, I'm going to tell you what they didn't do. So here's a kind of characterization of what sometimes happens in situations like this. So people might occasionally start kind of trying to undermine the position of the others and kind of throwing around some what might be termed academic insults at the research of the other party. They might kind of start trying to recruit additional evidence for their own side and trying to kind of bolster their own position. Now, this is not what they did. What they did instead is they jointly worked together to devise 4 experiments. It's a really interesting paper to read, particularly because it outlines what they did to set up this program of research. So it's 1988. Communication between different countries is not as straightforward as it would be now. So there's written correspondence, there's extensive phone calls, and a key thing is that all 3 people working on the project, although they had different expectations and different views, they agreed all the manipulations and instructions in advance. They shared out the task of directing the pieces of research, so 2 people each directed 2 studies, or 2 of the antagonists each directed 2 studies, and they employed research assistants who were blind to the hypotheses. And this, I think, is a really interesting feature of their research. So their start point was to sit down and to look at what were the differences between their previous research that might account for the fact that they obtain different findings when seemingly they're both looking at the same effect. So they had this process of brainstorming to identify all of the differences between the way that Latham and his colleagues ran their studies and the ways that Erez and her colleagues ran theirs. And a really intriguing comment in the paper is that many of the things that they identified as differences would not easily have been identified if all you had was the published research to guide you. So it was the process of sitting down together that identified some of these differences. And I think that speaks to the importance of transparency in and completeness in reporting methods. I'm just going to highlight a couple of these differences that I put on the screen. So these are the 5 main differences that they then use to build their studies around. And we'll see later on that the third of these turns out to be probably the kind of key difference. So in Latham's studies, when people are given a goal, they're given that goal in perhaps a more supportive way. So the importance of the goal is explained, and the researcher tells the participants that this is an achievable goal. So it's a stretch target, it's a challenging goal, but it's nonetheless one which is achievable. Whereas the instructions from Erez, when people are asked to attain a particular goal, so when they don't have any say in setting the goal, it's a much more kind of basic set of instructions. It's kind of, it's not so supportive. So they've got 4 studies. They've got 2 different tasks, and they've got a series of manipulations and also some participant measures that they take. And the key thing is that these manipulations relate to the differences in the previous research that they'd identified. They've got a number of outcome measures. They've got manipulation checks. And here's the summary of what they pull out from different experiments. So they're testing out whether these previous differences in methodology can explain the previous differences in findings. And when they indicate there's a large effect, this is one that occurs consistently across the experiments where it's examined, and also to a fairly large degree. Whereas when they say some effect, it's either not such a large effect or not consistently found across their different studies. So there's a few, for me, really interesting things in this paper. The first is that you get a really distinct view of the voice of the 3 different authors. So in fact, they have 3 separate discussion sections for part of their discussion, which is Latham's discussion, Erez's discussion, and Locke's discussion. And so you get a real sense of, when you're reading something, you are clearly seeing that this is the interpretation of one of the authors, or this is an agreed interpretation by all of the authors. And these quotes kind of illustrate that. And there's some other interesting features. So, I'm very positive about this paper, but there's definitely some things that don't quite work out in the intended way, and some things that perhaps wouldn't stand up to current standards of best practice. But here's a nice feature, something where they tried really hard to do the right thing. So they made sure that there was a experimenter who wasn't one of the lead authors who collected the data, and they weren't told anything about the hypotheses they were testing, and in fact they didn't have any contact with the antagonists or the authors, but as a consequence of that, it was perhaps difficult to actually set things up and make everything fully clear to the experimenter as to what they had to do. So study one has some flaws because there was some part of the data that they couldn't analyze, and they had to then re-examine that in study two. I've made the link between this approach and open science, and I just want to point out that what's this, over 30 years ago, really clearly in this paper, some concerns about to this group, perhaps very current concerns. So you can see concerns about reproducibility expressed within the paper. So this issue that, if all you've got to go on is a standard research article, it can be really difficult to do a high quality replication of a piece of research. So they point out that many of the features that were key to their investigation only came to light because they could go beyond the printed versions and discuss how each other had run their studies in the past. And they're proposing what I guess is essentially open materials, saying, wouldn't it be great if people were able to be really complete in their reporting and were allowed to actually give more detail than journals often permit for reasons of length. It's notable that essentially this paper comes from a failure to replicate. So intriguingly, of course, the null findings happen before the findings where a significant effect is found, but nonetheless it's focusing on a large body of studies that find little or no effect, and comparing that with a set of studies that find a more substantial effect. And the kind of concerns that people will often have today about researcher degrees of freedom, well, actually these are discussed in this paper. So the agreement in advance on methods, and therefore, because of the nature of this collaboration, there's almost a kind of something that's a bit like pre-registration. So it's clear to people who have an incentive to take a different view to you what procedures are being proposed and what procedures are being used. So I'm going to move on to another example of adversarial collaboration. This is probably the best known one. So certainly if you do a literature search, put in the term adversarial collaboration, quite a large proportion of the hits come up in relation to this paper, because it actually has, well, I've not actually reproduced the correct title here, the full title. It actually has adversarial collaboration in the title of the article. And a number of other papers cite this as an example of adversarial collaboration, as well as citing it as an example because of the research questions that it examines. So it examines the conjunction fallacy, which if you've come into your current role through doing a psychology undergraduate degree, is something that you might have come across before, or if you read Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, you'll probably see examples in there. And there's a sort of basic illustration that people, when they're given problems to reason about or asked to make judgments in relation to probabilities, that they don't necessarily reason according to the principles of the rules of probability, but they tend to use shortcut heuristics to arrive at answers. And so the conjunction fallacy, which Kahneman and Tversky attributed to the representativeness heuristic, occurs when the conjunction of two events is rated as more probable or judged as more probable than one of those other events. So, for example, the famous problem is called the Linda problem. You get this description of Linda, who as a student was very concerned about kind of social justice and the environment and things like this. And then you're asked, some years later, which is more probable, and you have a series of different possibilities. And included in that is what's, Linda's a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. That seems to fit well, the fact that she would be a feminist with the previous description. And that often gets judged more highly or ranked more highly in the list than the possibility that she's a bank teller. But as my little Venn diagram shows, if there exist feminists and there exist bank tellers, well, the intersection of those two sets, the feminist bank tellers, must be a subset of either one of those groups. Now, the incidence of this fallacy is reduced when you have a frequency format. So rather than asking how likely it is, or what's the probability, or what's the chance, or which of these is more probable, you ask questions framed in terms of, consider 200 individuals fitting Linda's description. So you kind of make an explicitly frequentist kind of frame for thinking about the problem. And people are much less likely to commit this conjunction fallacy. And so the two, if you like, antagonists, or the two parties with a dispute here are Ralph Hertwig and Danny Kahneman. And they have different views as to why the frequency format reduces the incidence of the conjunction fallacy. And Ralph Hertwig says the key thing is to do with the frequency format disambiguates the term and. So, for example, if I say to you, I threw a party for friends and colleagues, would you assume that that meant that everybody at the party was both a friend and a colleague? Or that that party might include some colleagues who weren't friends and some friends who weren't colleagues? So the term and is potentially ambiguous in some statements and can be legitimately interpreted in different ways. And so Hertwig has this view that the frequency format creates that disambiguation. So in this investigation, they had 3 experiments. From a scientific point of view, the key thing is that they were looking at different conjunction terms, so different phrases used to indicate the conjunction or intersection of sets. And they have Barbara Mellers, who is a fairly, at this point in time, already a senior and well-respected researcher in this research field, so in judgment and decision making. So that's their independent arbiter. And then they vary across different experiments, features such as the presence or absence of filler items. And in advance, they set out the process by which they would carry out their investigation. So experiment 1, they devised together, and the findings of that aligned better with Kahneman's predictions. And then they said each of the collaborators can propose a second experiment. So experiment 2 is proposed by Ralph Hertwig, experiment 3 by Danny Kahneman. And again, in this paper, there's a portion of the discussion where they write it separately. So it's Kahneman's discussion and Hertwig's discussion. And they give their alternative interpretations of the findings, but also note some points of agreement. And a key point of agreement is that they both feel that they've got a better feeling of the limitations of their own claims. And one would wonder whether, if this was one of them working independently, whether those limitations would have come to light or would have been accepted. So the adversarial collaboration potentially leads people to a greater willingness or a greater necessity to revise their own claims and their own position. And this paper has a set of guidelines, so a suggested approach that you might take if you're intending to run an adversarial collaboration. A key thing they say is, agree and record, commit to paper or a document exactly how the collaboration is going to be conducted. Record what results from an experiment would lead you to change your mind on your position, and agree any principles for any follow-up studies. So here they agreed that there would only be one follow-up study that each of the adversarial collaborators could propose. And they put a lot of power in the hands of the arbiter. So the arbiter is given the say on how the paper will be structured and authored. I think they also agreed something like that if one of the collaborators pulled out, that the arbiter would still be able to publish the data, and I think I mentioned on the previous slide that in fact it was the arbiter who actually did the data collection, was responsible for running the studies. And they do say, you're not always going to need an arbiter or a referee or a mediator in these sorts of investigations. But if there are particularly strong theoretical or methodological differences, then you ought to consider whether an arbiter is a valuable addition to the adversarial collaboration. So I thought, particularly for this audience, it might be worth saying a little bit about whether there are examples of this from clinical psychology. I'm aware of one, or one set of adversarial collaborations. No doubt there are more, because when I describe this, you'll see that it has a kind of format or shape that may actually have occurred in a number of different instances. But one area that people have specifically identified as potentially fruitful for adversarial collaboration is in relation to allegiance effects. So the finding is that clinician researchers who favour a particular therapeutic approach tend to report stronger evidence for that therapy's superiority over other possibilities. So put simply, if you favour a particular talking therapy, then you're more likely to have published papers that show that talking therapy is superior to other therapies. Whereas if you favour some kind of drug therapy, you're more likely to have published papers that show an advantage for that drug therapy over the alternatives. Now, that describes an association. So is there anything causal there? So one possibility is that people acquire their allegiance to a particular therapeutic approach because of what they happen to have observed in their own research. So there might be, just due to sampling variability, there will of course be variation in the size of effects as to whether one therapy has an advantage over another, and maybe even just that natural variability, if you happen to have seen an advantage for something, well then you acquire an allegiance to that particular approach. Of course, there are other possibilities that might be described as less mundane. So, for example, if you are an expert in a particular type of treatment, then you're likely to be better at delivering that treatment or overseeing its delivery by researchers in an RCT. There might be a tendency to select inferior comparisons. So, if you're selecting treatment as usual, well, you might have some version, might be tempted to, either inadvertently or deliberately identify a kind of version of treatment as usual, which is, not a particularly strong one. And of course, there may be an incentive to selective reporting. So the temptation to only report those things that align with your preconceptions and your particular allegiance. And so Lakin and de Roubaix, they point to this being a really good area where people with different viewpoints, in this case different allegiances, working together ought to lead us to better quality research. So Holland describes an adversarial collaboration, so in fact a series of collaborations whereby one set of researchers who are experts in drug treatment work together with another set of researchers who are cognitive therapists, and what he describes is, well, if each side looks after the treatment for which they're expert, then across a multi-site study, this ought to kind of balance out the allegiance effects. And that would be true no matter what sort of reasons lie behind the allegiance effect. This ought to reduce the bias, if you like, by having people with alternative views and alternative expertise, or differences in their types of expertise, collaborating together to actually identify the kind of relative merits of the two different therapies. And then the last set of adversarial collaborations I'd like to tell you about, I think for me, in some ways, the most impressive one. So this involves not two, but three different research teams, each with their own position, and all three of which agree to work together. And so it isn't just a single research paper that's the focus of this, but a whole series of investigations. So there are multiple papers coming out from this adversarial collaboration, and so they describe it as a programmatic adversarial collaboration. So it's in the arena of working memory. So Logie, Barillet and Cowan, three prominent researchers in the area. They each have their own model, but they work together to devise experiments which are joint tests of those models. So it's not just this experiment tests the predictions of this model, but it tests the competing predictions, in many cases, of all three models. And I've got a little screenshot here from their website, which you can jump onto to kind of see how they carry out their research. One of the features is that when they run their studies, they do so in multiple labs. So they always identify, I think, at least two of their labs in order to run the studies. And they offer some suggestions as to why that might be particularly useful, and why running studies in one lab might be a reason for finding different findings in different papers. So in common with lots of working memory researchers, they often use a dual task paradigm. So you have a secondary task which loads your working memory, and then you're doing some other task. And if you've got difference in the participant characteristics between different labs, then when you load memory with the intent of perhaps giving a low memory load to a participant, well, in some labs that might actually turn out to be a high memory load. So if you've got people, participants with systematically different characteristics in terms of their memory abilities, then you might get a difference between labs even with the same procedures, because your manipulations are working in different ways in different labs. And this, I think, illustrates quite nicely what they mean by a programmatic approach. So this is just from one paper. It's a 4-experiment paper, and what they have set out in those middle columns is not only whether the model predicts an effect, but also details of the size of effect that it predicts. So, for example, in that first row, the EP model predicts a larger effect than either of the other 2 models. And so they're not just conducting a kind of single one-shot test of a model. They've got an entire set of predictions, and the adequacy of the different models or the sort of evaluation of the adequacy of the different models relies on the extent to which the set of predictions fit well with the data, or the data fit well with the set of predictions, however you want to phrase that. And you can see here that sometimes it's not a specific prediction of the size of the effect, but rather saying, well, in this circumstance, it will be a larger effect than in this circumstance. And this strikes me as a really sort of challenging approach. You've got multiple predictions that are being made and pitted against each other. And so this little quote illustrates that, perhaps unsurprisingly, no one model kind of fits the data consistently across this large number of tests. And each of the researchers is acknowledging that they need to reconsider the core assumptions of their model and revise that. And in some of these papers, they set out rather nicely some of the benefits of their collaboration. So increases in terms of trust and more balanced writing, but also because more than one model is kind of accurately considered in the discussion of the findings, then they argue that this is going to be more fruitful for other researchers to build on. So you don't just kind of get a one-sided discussion that sort of sets out in detail what one model says and then kind of shoves to the side what another model says. And I think this quote at the bottom of the slide is an interesting acknowledgement that they make. They're saying, if this was just one of our research groups, we'd probably be kind of emphasizing the places where the model does well and saying very little about the places where the model doesn't do well. But because we're working together as a group of 3 labs who've got, different sort of views and different sets of predictions, we're not allowed to do that. So the agreement in writing leads to a kind of more balanced and a more nuanced and a more honest set of conclusions is what they're arguing. So just to finish up, in terms of now just kind of, taking these and other adversarial collaborations together, one thing we might claim is that this is an approach which can kind of get us closer to that ideal view of science that people sort of look to Karl Popper for, because if we're trying to set up kind of critical tests of falsifiable hypotheses, the argument is that we're more likely to achieve that if there's this collaboration between people who've got different views. So, you're not going to be able to kind of dismiss your opponent's position by kind of having a characterization of their position which is not accurate. You're forced to actually treat your opponent's views seriously and try and come up with studies that simultaneously test both approaches. I just want to highlight some of the links as I see it to other open science initiatives. So the process that collaborators describe in these papers is one in which their hypotheses and predictions are made public in advance. So much in the same way as you might have with pre-registration. Now, that public is very small. It might be just one or two other collaborators, but I think it's key that those one or two other collaborators are people who don't have the same investment in your preferred hypotheses and predictions. So there's this idea of the kind of ancient wisdom that iron sharpens iron. So kind of two people who are kind of coming together will actually sharpen the ideas of each other. And this is something that in a lot of the discussions of these papers is highlighted. People, authors often say, I was forced to articulate more clearly what my position was, almost as if, well, I didn't actually have a full appreciation of what my view was, or I didn't necessarily have a full appreciation of how to make my view clear to others without this process happening. Obviously, there's an emphasis on full disclosure of methods and procedures, because you have to establish a method and procedure that is both acceptable to you and to your collaborating opponent in setting up the study. And there's a kind of mutual accountability that this creates. So if you were going to hypothesize after the results are known, so harking, you'd have to have somebody collude with you, and if this person is coming from a different viewpoint, they wouldn't have much incentive to collude with you. Likewise with flexing research degrees of freedom in data analysis, or trying to put something in the file drawer and not publish. If you've worked with someone else with an opposing view, they may not have the same incentive for that to happen. So if you're saying, well, I wonder if we see the effect if we eliminate these participants, they likely don't have the same incentive for that to happen. And so it puts a check and a balance on there. And so my last little point is the title that I used for the talk, Science at its Best. This was kind of used by Latham, Errors and Locke in respect of their own investigation. I know that probably exhibits a slight lack of immodesty, but I do think that people who take on this approach, and it's not common, deserve a good deal of credit for actually their openness in this particular approach. So opening their views up to proper test and scrutiny, and in a sense, putting themselves in a position where they can actually have potentially quite a public failure from one standpoint. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tim, for your talk. That was really insightful, and I know, for one, I was not aware of a lot of this work that's being done. So I know, at least I personally have learned a lot. So thank you for that. We actually have quite a few comments. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through them in the order in which they've been upvoted. So let me just see. So the top sort of upvoted comment is from Sam Westwood. So I'll read his question first, and I'll actually read a comment that someone else posted in response to that, and then I'll give you space to answer it. So Sam said, as science moves forward, big teams of science with large teams of hundreds of researchers, a practical issue that comes up is finding independent peer reviewers to review from these projects. One semi-solution is to make sure that big team science projects have a transparent adversarial approach. Any thoughts on this? And I guess a quick comment from David in the comments. He just said all 4 of the Nobel Prize winners that I know did the experiments with their own hands with a single collaborator. So I wonder if you have any sort of thoughts on the way that doing science has changed and how we can move forward.
So I think on Sam's comment, I think taking a look at the approach in that last set of collaboration is probably really interesting. So interestingly, they describe they use the postdoctoral researchers across the 3 labs in kind of the mediator or arbiter role. So what they describe is that the postdoctoral researchers will have less investment in any one of the models than the 3 senior researchers who've been kind of devising and testing and proposing their model for 20 years. And so they have a team approach, but they kind of, I guess it's a pragmatic bit of social psychology to say, well, if we're going to have people who are actually in a better position to be somewhat more independent and kind of flexible in terms of kind of advancing the process, they actually look to their postdoctoral researchers to do that. So I don't know if that doesn't quite answer the point that Sam was making, but I think that's for me would be the interesting one of these to look at.
Yeah, and I think that links very nicely with the other example that you gave in your talk with sort of using research assistants who are blind to the hypothesis that's being tested. So yeah, I think that's definitely a great suggestion, and I guess it links relatively well into the next question that we have from Anonymous, which is, how do you manage inevitable disputes and even power imbalances? Adversarial collaboration. For example, you can imagine the norm is to defer to senior academics, even when a more junior academic might have merit in point.
Yeah, so I guess this might be. I mean, Kahneman, Mellers, and Hertwig, they suggested, well, bring in an arbiter when you've got kind of very clear theoretical or methodological differences, and I guess the same advice might apply for this type of research if you've got a clear kind of seniority power imbalance, and so in fact in that paper it probably was true to say that it was. So I think Ralph Hertwig might have been a postdoc at the time. He wouldn't have been very different from, I don't know, early 30s or something. And Danny Kahneman was about to get the Nobel Prize for economics, the next year. and was sort of massively senior researcher. Now there's other adversarial collaborations that have got Cardinal involved, and they don't have an arbiter. But I guess if you've got the this principle that you agree things and you write things down in advance, and in a sense you ought to be preempting some of those situations where one person defers to the other.
Thank you. So let me just see which one's next. So yeah, I guess this one from Sam again. So Sam was asking, are you aware of examples of how adversarial collaboration can be incorporated in higher education? So for example, in a dissertation project or as part of coursework?
No. Quick answer. I haven't seen examples like that. I mean, there really are a very small number of examples, or at least kind of ones that are signalled as such. I guess informally, lots of things will have the character of this, where you've got people with somewhat different views, but I guess this smallish number of papers are really situations where it's very clear what the difference in views are between the different proposers, or what the differences in their previous data sets are.
Yeah, I guess it's quite similar to the way that universities have now started to incorporate things like pre-registration for undergraduate or master's dissertations. So I guess if there was a way to incorporate adversarial collaboration in the way that undergraduates or master students, PhD students conduct their work, that would be, I guess, a great way forward to teach the more early career researchers how to move forward.
I mean, it certainly occurred to me, very early on in the so I coordinate a couple of year 1 research methods modules, and week 2, we're talking about falsification, falsifiability, testable hypotheses, and when you read about that in a textbook, you might imagine that a lot more science was like these adversarial collaborations, where you pit one hypothesis against another with competing predictions. But I guess often things don't quite work like that. So even where it's presented that there are competing predictions, the danger is that you give an advantage in some way in your design to your preferred hypothesis or your preferred prediction. And I guess this is one way to try and mitigate against that tendency for us to recruit evidence to support and bolster our positions, rather than to genuinely engage in kind of critical tests of our positions.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess I'll continue with a question that is, I guess, not in the order of most upvoted, but it's related to this one, which is from Anonymous. It is, what are the avenues by which one might be able to start or take part in an adversarial collaboration? You said at the start that adversarial collaboration isn't well known about, so I wonder how many journals other researchers would seek to publish in this way.
So, so I guess one of the so when you read these papers, some of them are kind of explicit in terms of saying how they started, and it's sometimes people were at a conference and they got talking after a talk, and they kind of they kind of decided that actually if they objected on a sort of scientific level to something that someone else has said, that this would be something where they could work together and try and do the tests. So these do tend to sort of start kind of through conferences, for example, is one way. Then I mean, the reason I guess I first came across this because someone drew my attention to the Mellers, Hertwig and Kahneman paper. So I guess almost 20 years ago or so now. And I'm a journal editor, and so we explicitly said that we would accept adversarial collaborations. Now, at that time, I kind of imagined that what then might occasionally happen is that if I had a paper where a reviewer was kind of being kind of very kind of anti against a publication, that actually I might say, well, I'll accept the paper, but maybe we actually suggest that you work together. Now, to my shame, I've not done that, although actually I guess I don't come across really kind of reviewers who kind of object so strongly. But it's certainly been proposed as an alternative to kind of that style of publication where you have a publication and a rejoinder and a response to a rejoinder. So rather than kind of having that debate through the kind of rewriting of the argument in a journal, that you actually engage at a more empirical level and actually so I guess there could be an avenue for journals to promote this. So any time that somebody is wanting to kind of write a comment or a rejoinder, that actually you could be saying, well why not collaborate empirically to address this. So I guess that's a couple of suggestions. But yeah, I think it's a genuinely difficult thing to set up, because everybody needs to be prepared to take a risk. So they need to be well prepared to take a risk that they can be shown to be wrong in a somewhat public way, and different people will have different levels of tolerance for that.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really comprehensive answer. I think it addressed many of the points that were raised in that question. So I think we only have time for one or maybe two more questions. But yeah, the next one's a sort of a big question. So do you think there are any barriers to implementing adversarial collaboration in the current research climate? And if so, do you think there are any incentives for individual academics to implement them in their workflow?
So again, I mean, if you look at some of the papers that kind of reflect on adversarial collaboration, and so a number of them actually, they're intriguing papers because they're both a question about. So they're both a paper about their research question and a paper about their research process. But the kind of points that are made are things like, well, you have to have at least that you can't have people who are working in completely different paradigms. It will be very difficult for them to work together. So there has to be a kind of a level of agreement that exists in terms of what counts as a legitimate measure and what counts as a legitimate test before you can work together. So that's kind of one obvious barrier. I don't know how you can kind of work around that unless you've got somebody who really is kind of very comfortable with taking a very different approach in a new piece of research to what they did previously. So one barrier I think is just when people are just coming with quite different research paradigms to the same question, is one barrier. And I mean, I think in terms of removing barriers, I suspect that kind of journals would be pretty positive about this. Certainly I, as a journal editor, I think I would be very positive, or as a reviewer, if something like this came across my desk, I think I would, be very positive about, favouring this type of research, relative to other, similar questions that didn't take this approach, because in a sense it's already had some review. It's already had a degree of review, between the adversaries in order to even get to the stage where they've got the data and they're proposing the paper. So I guess that's kind of, the other thing is that people point out, you don't have to hate the person to treat them as a scientific adversary. And so people have often reported that it is actually been fun to do this, and they feel like it's more productive because of bringing together the different viewpoints and kind of forcing yourself to articulate your position clearly, to articulate your predictions more clearly, and to say, well, what would actually cause you to change your mind? These sorts of things are satisfying because people feel like they lead to better science.
Thank you, Tim. I guess that's a wonderful sort of note to end it on. So thank you so much for your time. Do stay on the call so we can sort of debrief right after. But for everyone who's still sort of left on the call, thank you. Do remember to sort of subscribe to our YouTube, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our mailing list so that you get emails about these events. And do check out our event next week, which is Dr. Hannah Hobson, How Do We Apply Open Science Practices to Neurodevelopmental Research? Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the week.